So to show you how to make a gradient, I'm going to show you two practices that I'll do. One doing a gradient wash with just one color and one doing a gradient wash with two colors, which is what I do most often for skies. What I'm going to start with is a thicker brush. This is an oval mop, and it's definitely wider than the brushes that I've been using in previous videos, like this number 8 round. And the reason I'm using it first is because I'm going to wet my whole paper, and this holds a lot of water. If you're using something small like a number 8 round, you're just going to have to reapply water to get the whole area covered with water, but that's fine. So I'm starting by getting water on my brush. I'm going to use a wet and wet technique, which means that I'm laying down water first and getting the paper wet, and then I'm putting in wet paint. That's what I'll do often for first layers. I've drawn a box on my paper. It doesn't need to be perfect, just so that I can stay within the boundaries. And I'm just getting that whole area wet with water. I'm going over it a couple of times. The edges will dry before the center will dry because the edges are touching dry paper, which means that there's not that area of moisture soaking into it as well. Whereas the center is surrounded by other wet areas, so it will stay moist for longer. Now at this point, my paper is very wet. You can see how shiny it is, and if I tip it, the water will pool to one side. It's kind of hard to see on the video. Okay. That angle, yeah, you can see how wet it is. I'm gonna let it soak in for just a minute or two so that it's shiny, but it's not puddling. All right, this area has gotten a chance for the water to soak in, and when I turn it, it's not pooling so much. It's definitely shiny, it's definitely wet, but it's gotten a chance to soak into the paper, so that's perfect. The color I'm going to use for this for this gradient wash is Indigo by Daniel Smith. The reason I'm choosing it is so that you can see the range that this color has. It's almost like a midnight black all the way down to a really pretty blue, so you can really see the gradient here. I'm going to start darkest at the top and try to go down to nearly clear at the bottom. I've loaded my brush up. I've put it in water. I'm swirling it around the color. The puddle is about the consistency of milk. And right now, you can see that the edges get kind of blurred. That's because it's wet and wet. We're not gonna have what's called a hard edge where it's just this crisp, clear line because the paint is bleeding into the water. I've dipped my brush just a little bit into the water to release some of that pigment so that it can just get incrementally lighter. And I'm just doing these horizontal strokes back and forth. After I've done a couple more, I'll go in, swirl my brush a little bit again. Be a little bit more. Dab it off on the paper towel. And now my brush has almost no pigment on it anymore. And now what I'll do is I'll look at it, and what I see here is it's pretty dark up here, and then it's pretty much the same grade or the same shade all the way down here. same intensity. So I'm going to get more indigo, really load up my brush, and to get a nice smooth gradient wash, I will go over this several times. I can get really fussy with it, but I really don't want to see these lines, even if they're not hard edges. I really want it to be smooth. I'm going to do a little more up here. I'm not worrying about the fact that I'm coloring a little bit outside the lines, because if I were doing this for a final landscape, I would have taped the paper down so that when you remove the tape at the end, it gives a nice clear line. And now I'm going to start at the bottom and go up. I might do that again. Watercolor will dry about 20 to 30% lighter than it goes down wet. So that bottom part is going to dry really light, which is what I want. Notice I'm going back up and back down, and again, that's just to get a really smooth wash. I'm pretty happy with that. As it dries, it'll smooth out a little bit more because the water is doing some of the work for you. You could go over it again to really darken up that top. I would let this dry, and then I would put in maybe some hills overlapping and have a nice, really simple landscape. Now I'm going to show you this process using two colors. This can be a little bit more challenging because as the colors blend, you want to make sure that they blend in a way that you like. I'm going to start with the same process by getting the paper wet, leaving it for a minute or two, and then adding my color. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. For the two colors, I'm going to use Cobalt Teal and Opera Rose. And both of these colors are really bright and fun and happy, and it's gonna look a little bit tropical. I'm gonna do the Cobalt Teal up above and the Opera Rose down below. And because I've used these colors a lot, I know that Cobalt Teal can be really aggressive. It's by a company called Core, and they use an ingredient, I think it's a binding agent, that really just like whooshes and takes over. So with that in mind, I'm not gonna take it down halfway. I'm gonna start at the top and let it kind of move, and then add the pink so that the pink has a chance to kind of spread up that way a bit. I have a lot of that Cobalt Teal on my brush. You can see it's already wanting to move around. It's a really fun, energetic color. And I've just done the top third with Cobalt Teal. So I'm going to start in the bottom third with the Opera Rose. And then when they meet in the middle, it'll be more of a purpley mixture. Again, I'm trying to do horizontal straight lines. You can see these tendrils of blue coming down already. It really wants to mix. Without lifting my brush, I'm going back and forth, and you can see by the time I get to the top, I don't have any more pink on my brush. And I turn right back around and go down. And already you can see how smooth that transition is. Because I'm going back and forth in straight lines without lifting my brush, it's really mixing well. I'm actually really happy with that, but I'm gonna try to make the pink a little bit more vibrant at the bottom and maybe the cobalt teal more vibrant at the top. Maybe I will learn that I should have just stopped. That's okay. Getting more of that cobalt teal. And once again, I'm going to meet them in the middle, go all the way down, go all the way back up. And hopefully we get that really smooth wash. Painting outside the lines, that's okay. I'm not pressing down really, really hard with my brush, just kind of dragging it back and forth. If I feel like it's not really smooth, I'll do the process again, back and forth. That's why you want to use paper that's not going to pill and that can handle a lot of brush strokes and a lot of moisture. Pretty. I'm going to let that dry. And I would use either of those as backgrounds for little landscapes. For my last gradient wash, I'm going to be showing you how I would mix a blue and a yellow in order to avoid getting a lot of green. And for this, I got new clear water because the other water was getting pretty blue, and that's going to muddy up the yellow right away. The two colors I'm going to use are Naples Yellow, which is this really nice, soft, peachy color. And I'm going to use Ultramarine Blue. Mixing these two together, you get this sagey, almost gray-green, which would be really pretty as a leaf or a floral, but I don't really want that color in my sky. So to avoid it, I just need to be a little bit more careful. I'm going to start the process the same way by wetting my paper and then waiting. Because I'm using a larger size for the paper, usually I'll start with a cute little 5x7, but this is a little bit bigger, so I'm going to use a bigger brush. This is a number 12. I'm going to start with the blue at the top. Ultramarine blue is a really nice blue, kind of all-purpose blue. I use it for skies, I use it for water, I use it for mixing greens. It's kind of my go-to. The process is going to be the same. Horizontal lines back and forth with my brush. Because I'm using a bigger brush, I don't need to use as many strokes back and forth. Because the blue is going to overpower the yellow, because the yellow is really soft, I'm only going to do the top third. And then I'll add in the yellow. And if I were going to continue this as a landscape, I would probably put hills or something down here. So I'm not going to leave the yellow down here. I'm probably going to bring it up halfway so that if you put hills in the front, you can still see the yellow. Already it's fading a lot into the water, you can see. The water is doing some of the work for me. And I'm really cautious about having the two meet. I'm not just going to town and going all the way down and all the way up and all the way down and all the way up. I'm gonna do some of my blending in the middle here. Every time I move from blue to yellow, I'm really rinsing off my brush, because if there's any blue left on the brush, it's just going to overtake that yellow. Starting to see a little bit of green, so I can just pick that back up with my brush after I've dabbed it on the paper towel. And I'm going to use some water to start to encourage these colors to mix. Or to do a gradient. Mix isn't the right word, because if they mix, I get green. You can see I'm a lot more tentative with the other two, with the other gradient, with the Cobalt Teal and the Opera Rose. I really wanted them to mix, so I just went do all the way down, all the way up, all the way down, and I wanted that purpley color in the center. This time when I get to the center, I'm slowing down. I'm not dragging my brush over and over and over. That's really gonna mix them. I'm kind of placing the colors there. The water will have them do a gradient without necessarily mixing heavily into a green. I'm way more cautious. I'm using water, clear water, to smooth that out. I'm not too worried about this bottom area because I would cover it up. But here, I'm getting pretty happy with how these are blending. It's a little bit streaky here, but it's very wet, and I think as it dries, it's going to soften some of that. Had a droplet of water fall down there. Notice when the water comes down here, it pushes the pigment away and it does something called a bloom. That's because the water droplet is more moist than the drying paint on the paper. And blooms are something that when you know how to do them and how to control them, they can be really fun. If you don't want them to happen though, they can kind of ruin your day. Because it's so wet, I'm just smoothing it out. No big deal. The last thing I'm gonna do is add in just a little bit more yellow, because by the time I get up to the center, it's really gone down to clear, and that's gonna be the last thing I do. slowing down as they start to meet. But at this point, the blue has taken over and there's no more yellow on my brush. Okay, I'm gonna let that dry. And then I'll talk about what you can do for next stages after you have a gradient. Okay, so I've let that gradient wash dry, and you can see that it's dried a lot lighter than when I put it down wet. There's no green in sight because we went really slowly in the middle and used a lot of water to blend it together. To finish it up, just to make a simple landscape, I put some gray hills in. The farther back you go, the lighter it is, and then the middle ground is a little bit darker and the front is significantly darker. And you have a nice little landscape. I'm happy that I put the yellow up all the way here, about 2/3, because if I had only done it the first third, it would all get covered up by the hills. The practice washes came out really nicely as well. I really like this one. If I were to do this as a final landscape, I would probably do a silhouette of maybe a beach and a palm tree, just kind of going along with that tropical feel. And then with this single color wash, maybe I would put some stars and maybe a snowy landscape in the front. There are a lot of things you can do once you've gotten a background of a gradient wash. With this single gradient wash, I added in stars by using white paint and a toothbrush, or I've used gel pens, and this is all one color. I believe it's all indigo. Here's another one where I did the blue into the yellow. And because I was gonna do a mountain landscape, instead of doing the whole thing in the blue and the yellow, I used a pencil to draw out my line. And then I filled in this top area with water and did blue down to yellow here. It's a little bit harder maintaining the boundaries of the mountain and kind of going along there because you want to make sure that you still get an even wash without bringing your brush all the way down here. One other thing that you could do is add clouds and texture over top of the gradient wash once it's completely dry. So for this one, I let the gradient wash of blue and yellow dry completely. Then I went back over the dry paper and painted in some cloud shapes. So I hope you try this out. I hope my tips have been helpful to you and that you can make some beautiful gradient washes in order to create some landscapes of your own. See you next time.